Welcome everyone to today's webinar on precision medicine and health IT, based on Chomark Research's latest report, Precision Medicine and Health IT, New Data Challenges. I'm Hannah Enley, Chomark's marketing lead and today's webinar moderator. Before we begin, I should note we are recording this webinar and we'll include it in our follow-up email. If you have any questions during the presentation or discussion, please submit them via the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel that should have popped up alongside the presentation screen. We will address them at the end of the webinar as part of the discussion. Next, I'd like to introduce Chomark Research. As an analyst firm, we are united by a core belief that effective deployment and use of health IT is essential to modernizing care delivery and ultimately improving the patient journey. We monitor trends and developments in the industry with a focus on those technologies that will be transformational to healthcare delivery. We provide comprehensive, objective, high-quality research for busy executives. It's our way to help create a more informed, future-ready market of products and consumers. Leading today's webinar and presenting highlights from the report is Chomark's Senior Analyst, Jody Rank. Also joining us is Michael Dillian, a digital health and biotech entrepreneur who will present on data management and informed consent aspects of precision medicine. Michael also brings an international perspective to today's discussion from his work in both the US and Europe. With that, Jody, would you like to tell us about your research?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah, and good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to be going over some of the top line items from our precision medicine report that we're just in the process of releasing. So in the report, we look at everything from the various omic sciences and wearables, health IoT, the challenges of integrating this into the existing health IT infrastructure, and then some of the issues around everything from ethics, informed consent, and social issues. And along the way, we also go into a sort of summary of some of the most interesting vendors that we'll provide you with a list of those at the end of this webinar. Those that we think were the most interesting to look at, primarily at this sort of integration between DNA repositories or the omic sciences and health IT. So in the webinar today, we're going to be going over some of those same issues. We're not going to do a whole lot of deep dives into different vendors, but we will provide a list of the vendors that we cover in the report. So for the purposes of our report, we defined precision medicine as an effort to collect, integrate, and analyze multiple sources of genetic and non-genetic data, applying data analytics, machine learning, and AI to develop insights about how health and disease can be tailored to an individual, but also be used for targeting population health management or public health as well. And one of the big key drivers of precision medicine is the rise of the various omic sciences, beginning early on with the genomic data, but increasingly data from the transcriptome, microbiome, exposome, and so on, as you can see in this table that Eric Topol recently used in an article in Cell. And you also have the ability to do combinatorial omics by using data sets from these various omic things to find insights about causal mechanisms of disease, or in drug discovery, down to stratifying patients in more narrow ways based on the various omic insights or personal genome information. But there's still an awful lot of challenges in data mining and modeling as you combine these data sets. There's a lot of hype at large around AI and its role in precision medicine, and it's definitely a very, very important factor, but we're still in the very early days of both precision medicine and AI. And there are some of the key challenges there are around the sort of computational challenges when you're dealing with the multi-scale nature of these very large data sets and the actual heterogeneity and complexity within the data sets, and even getting them to the point where you can run your AI engines on this data to uncover insights. But nevertheless, AI is a big driver, and we can see just a very brief example here in cardiovascular medicine, increasing role of AI across the whole sort of value chain of cardiovascular medicine, from drug development, drug discovery, to population health management, even down to the sort of economics of care as well. There are AI applications, startups, tools, and so forth being developed. But having said that, it's still not the cure-all for a lot of our analytics challenges. Increasingly, we're seeing more discussion around the bias in AI, and that can extend from the bias in the original data itself, given who's been included or excluded from clinical trials and the development of that raw data. So you run the risk of sort of amplifying bias down that analytics value chain if we don't address some of these challenges. There are also issues around the fact that most AI has been developed for associational analytics, whereas a great deal of the work we need to have done from an analytics perspective in medicine deals more at the level of causality. And so machine learning, AI are somewhat underdeveloped when it comes to causal inference. So the bulk of our report really looks at this integration point of taking the omics sciences and rapidly expanding amount of data from the health IoT, social determinants, and so forth, and integrating that into the point of care via our existing health IT tools in a way that clinicians and patients can actually use this data. Some of the challenges there are well known around the lack of structured data, the storage capacity of EHRs, with genetic lab tests and so forth. It becomes more complicated when you have to collect the data from a family history and getting that family pedigree into that analysis, and sometimes even notifying family members through that. There's a lack of standards for laboratory tests. And then often what you see from a laboratory test will be a 20-page PDF file that will have a lot of references to different interpretations of that underlying science or the laboratory results, because the vast majority of conditions out there are not monogenic, they're polygenic, and there may be the science may not have an absolute or resolute or definitive answer for that patient. So then you're dealing with the realm of Bayesian probabilities that you have to translate in a way that the patient can understand it. So it's a very complex environment where we're taking different disease phenotypes, given the genetic data about specific diseases, integrating other omic data sets into that, integrating clinical data or even claims data, and ingesting that into a platform where you can analyze that, discover the insights that can then be used to stratify patients and offer more precise treatments. That's the general sort of data flow, which requires obviously a great deal of data sharing and then preparing the data so that it can be shared and analyzed. Those are incredibly difficult tasks at the moment for a lot of conditions. And so what we're seeing is that the majority of offerings out there are in the area of oncology. And so what we looked at for this study in terms of vendors and programs out there is what I'm calling is these platforms of cooperation. The reason why we're talking about that or using that language is to enable precision medicine to happen is going to require a great deal of data sharing, which is very difficult right now. All sorts of different types of data that need to be utilized for the analytics, and so coming up with more innovative structures to govern data sharing and sort of the use of data is going to be a key challenge that needs to be addressed. However, we do see a number of vendors that are already doing relatively good jobs in integrating data and then providing actionable clinical insights to patient or providers who can then offer that to their patients. So what some of the examples we look at in the report would, we first begin with the precision medicine initiative started under Obama to and the All of Us program, which is building out the genomic database that's more representative of the US population. It includes those who've been excluded in the past. And so we can begin addressing just one avenue of many we need to take to begin addressing that issue of bias in the underlying data for precision medicine, and then creating the tools to share that data. And one of the really interesting partnerships that we look at in the report is the eMERGE partnership run out of the National Human Genome Research Institute, which tries to bring together the DNA repositories and EHR systems so that you can create large-scale, high-throughput genetic research that can be translated into genetic medicine. And one of the early sort of victories of eMERGE was coming up with first, it's very difficult. It takes a lot of labor to take clinical phenotype data and move it across multiple networks. And so they created a common data model in order to make this easier. And in the last month or so, they actually released a paper showing that now that they've done this, one of the tools that they've created makes it much easier to query databases on the clinical phenotype data, so that these queries that would take several weeks to get the answer to in the past now are done in less than a day without practically zero errors. And so what they're doing is really trying to make these tools at the interface of the DNA repositories and EHRs that can make the clinical workflow for precision medicine work more seamlessly. However, there's still a long way to go. Some of the other examples we look at in the report include SciAps, Flatiron Health, and To Be Precise, among others. And what we see with many of these vendors is they're building networks of oncology providers, and for example, in the example of Flatiron Health, they first initiated an oncology-specific EHR, and the network that could enable them to create, to move beyond sort of a fragmented, siloed, silos of clinical, real-world, molecular treatment and outcomes data, and bring those together so that the sort of precision medicine insights could be generated, and then work on translating that into actionable intelligence for clinicians. They also work extensively with biopharmaceutical companies, because those same data sources are extremely valuable, obviously, in drug development and drug discovery. And another important feature of these data integrators is helping clinicians help patients to find the right clinical trials. That's often a very not a very easy task to do, but through the tools that they're creating in these data integration platforms, making that much easier to accomplish. So now I'm going to turn to Michael, who's going to address some of the data management issues and informed consent issues that he's seen in his experience.
Thanks, Jody, and thanks to Chilmark for inviting me to present on this. I think one of the interesting pieces about data sharing is we have a very sophisticated data collection, is at the forefront of even government initiatives, such as these recent agreements between the FDA and the medtech industry in terms of creating pilot programs for using real-world evidence to support expanded indications of use and sort of reduce this horrible pre-market burden in terms of submissions. That's, for me, the jumping off point when you see this move out of the realm of, let's say, the startup sphere into more of the public sector. And I think, there's also a new opportunity here to augment sort of your traditional data aggregators, IQVIA, who sell if you will, or broker legacy cross-sectional post-market data to healthcare and life sciences buyers. And we've got this very interesting dynamic happening between legacy and public sector. And then, of course, the key players in this space will be the wearables and sort of IoT folks, who are going to be the ones who are going to discover how to build these early relationships with strategic partners that end up significantly shortening or maybe even eliminating this current multi-billion-dollar health data supply chain that we're facing. Jody, if you'll just go to the next slide for me, please. And no problem is worth discussing if we don't really kind of discuss where we were at, where we are now, and where we're going in terms of this idea around health data sharing or health data exchange, if you will. And we can see pretty clearly here that there's been a sea change. We're sort of turning stakeholders to share back to stakeholders, but now we're moving into more of an individual-centric environment, which is really key to deinstitutionalizing this whole model around patients. We have, essentially an opportunity to go from what we currently have today from an identity perspective. We use lots of sophisticated methodologies to de-identify patient data. And really, and we spend a lot of time and energy in healthcare and life sciences from a regulatory perspective, HIPAA in the United States, making sure that we separate this by law data and identity. But in the future, what we're going to see is that's done organically. Your data and your identity will be kept separate as a function of the technology itself versus a regulatory piece. And then, of course, how do you go about getting to your data? How do the entities in your healthcare sphere or life sciences sphere, if it will, access your data? There's a lot of discussion in both the United States and Europe around this. In Europe, we have GDPR. In the United States, there's a number of initiatives around having an audit, some sort of audit or chain of custody around your data. And really, again, the answer here is, we have systems and technologies that are coming online where we're going to have we're going to provide to patients, and really probably the better word here is individuals, a very easy granular access and control method with some provenance, baked into it. Jody, next slide, please. And that's really version 3.0 of where this whole idea of health data sharing is going. I think if you look at health data as a big picture, we've got this the issue around collecting it with high veracity and specificity and cheaply. Sometimes I call it cheap deep sensing. And then we have the idea that Jody referred to earlier around analysis, and we have deep learning and machine learning, and the aggregate of that and artificial intelligence. I mean, what are we going to do with it? What sort of decisions will we make with it? But again, at the piece that's still being worked on is this idea of how will we exchange it? How will we move it around? In version 3.0 here of how to do that, it gets away from this idea of patient data ownership. I think that's version 2.0. I certainly spent a lot of time thinking about that. It gets away even from this idea of the rights or owning the rights to the data. These ideas were, I think, the logical evolution of thinking because we're thinking about data as an asset. Unfortunately, data is a unique asset in that it can be replicated over and over and over at very little cost. And that becomes very difficult to maintain a specific ownership over it without some kind of chain of custody. So what we have here is this idea of consent as a service, essentially a big switch that allows you to decide all throughout the value chain of where patients' data has been shared to turn it on and off. This is a big boon. This idea itself, actually, there's a organization in the United States called humanity.co. Richie Eduardo is the founder of it. They're doing a really nice job of popularizing this. And it's this, again, this general idea is, how do we create a framework for what consent means? And then once we do that, how do we put this layer of technology and embed it into our technology stack? And of course, there's a lot of questions around this sort of thing. It's the idea of taking something complex and making it simple. I think Einstein said something along those lines. There's a bit of genius in it, and probably also keeping it simple. But again, we're looking at these ideas around what really is the issue, and if we understand the core issue, which really it's about consent, then we can build the solutions towards it.
So, Michael, to sort of as a launching point from there, kind of where do you see precision medicine going the next 2 to 3 years? What can we expect to see maybe 3 years from now that we're not seeing right now? And then we can launch into some other questions, perhaps even addressing blockchain and identity management, because I heard the terms provenance and chain of command. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about those two issues.
Sure. Well, I can talk about where I think precision medicine is going in terms of health data management. And, where I see it going, there's a couple of problems with the idea of precision medicine. And I think you had a slide from Topol and others that talk about it's not terribly precise at the moment. And why is it not precise? Because it's extremely difficult to get down to the individual layer when we're thinking about deploying these therapies and these diagnostics to patients. And so where I see the future going, as outlined in the last few slides, is I see a lot of attention being paid, a lot of energy focused around how can we build these technology and regulatory conduits so that we're able to look at the individual. I mean, yes, it's important to obviously baseline the individual within their groups or their demographics to ascertain what, if anything, their data might mean from a bigger perspective. But again, patients are asking for it from a patient value perspective. I see, Jody, patients want to have the same personalized service that they enjoy in, buying a fast-moving consumer good. They want to see that in medicine or in healthcare, and that's where I see it going because of the ability to drive down this data exchange to the individual layer.
I think that raised, as you were speaking, it raised a really interesting issue around this sort of algorithmic role and sort of the socio-ethical dimensions of that. Because even if people are watching their Netflix and you get a recommendation, it doesn't always fit. And although that may sound like a superfluous comparison when it comes to medicine, you're still going to have at that physician-patient encounter subjective interpretations. So I think that's one of the areas that I think is quite interesting to think about artificial intelligence. You see more and more people talking about it as augmented intelligence, so that you still have that human dimension there, and that human dimension will take this, whatever is served up algorithmically through the diagnostics, but have degrees of freedom for that interpretive solution to the problem, and not just be the answer in itself derived through AI or whatever other analytics tool you're using as well. I see we're down to several more minutes. So Hannah, did you want to get questions from the audience?
Yes. Well, first, what are the key bottlenecks around healthcare, internet? Well, first of all, everybody, you can submit your questions on the right-hand side on the questions tab, and I'll collect them and ask. But no, either of you, what are the key bottlenecks around healthcare, Internet of Things do you see, and how should we address them?
Do you want to go first, Michael?
Sure, I'll give it a stab. I think I've seen plenty of them. I think you could put the bottlenecks into three big buckets. The first one is cost, and by that I mean reimbursement. There's a lot of fabulous technology, both invasive and non-invasive, from a sensor perspective, and in healthcare and life sciences, it's a strange industry to sell into because your customer isn't the patient, and it certainly isn't the clinician in most cases. So one is the economics. Two is a regulatory component. I think I feel like there's good news there. Speaking of Flatiron, you have folks like Dr. Abernathy that are that have been in the FDA, that have also worked in a startup and understand the key issues around onboarding that and some of the recent dialogue. But it still is it's still a big deal in terms of how those things get to commercial success. And then finally, and not to pound this drum too much, but that's what we're talking about today. It's the idea around data transparency, and that is absolutely there's always a balance. If you ask life sciences executives, what would you like in private, they always say, well, gee, I'd like less data less data privacy, more transparency. But if you ask them in public, heaven's sake, they'd never say anything like that, because it's still a hot button, if you will.
I think I would add cybersecurity to that as well. If you look at most analyses of the apps, for everything from fitness to generic health apps, cybersecurity is very, very weak. Health data is becoming more and more valuable in the sort of dark markets and so forth. So that needs to be baked in from the beginning, especially with the AI piece as well. So I think that's a major shortcoming in the marketplace as well.
I'd agree, Jody.
Actually, with this discussion of cybersecurity and data brokering, can we talk more about the value of an individual's data, both to the individual as well as the system? Obviously, large databases with many individuals is very valuable, but can you address why we should care about one single set of data from an individual?
Jody?
Sure. I'm not exactly sure what they're driving at.
Especially with this came up during Michael's discussion of consent and data access.
Ah, okay.
Okay. So Michael, do you want to go? And then
Sure, absolutely. So listen, there's this interesting idea, especially when, way back in 2012, when I started thinking about this sort of thing, about health data sharing on a global scale, that entities want to steal individuals' data. And really there's just absolutely, the economics aren't right there. And most health data privacy issues are really not about let's say, health data itself. It's about all the rich identity information in there. Having said all that, I think what we don't know is what is scary. I recently saw an article about I won't say on this webinar, but there's a company it turns out has been readily sharing DNA information from individuals. And what we don't know what you could do with that should worry people at an individual layer. And it shouldn't be, I'm worried about large institutions as much as I'm worried about exactly what that means, maybe even on a micro level. What sort of decisions could be made about me that have nothing to do, in some cases, with life sciences.
I think, as I think about the question, several years ago, the N of 1 studies began popping up as that, something is going to become quite important. And then I recently read an analysis of, the existing N of 1 studies, and the results of those were not that promising outside of a few areas. So I think there's one example where that individual data for that individual who's not getting relief from a condition and engages in an N of 1 study where they get a kind of precision medicine like application through that N of 1 study, that's valuable. Then if you look at it at a different scale in terms of the rise of these data markets like humanity and what we were doing at Health Bank and so forth, that market to create, sort of turn that individual's data, engaging in these platforms into a collectivity of data from these individuals. That's where Apple and their Apple Health and Apple Research, all of that, they're looking at how do we get people to curate their own data and then create a market on top of that, and then hopefully bring some return back to patients on that. I think that whole data market example there, I think Vince Karitis has counted at least 60, maybe much higher actually. I think some other folks have it in over 100. But when you look at the value of that individual's data, it's typically pennies. It's you can put all this effort into curating your data, and then you're not going to get much of a return on that. So in terms of a platform play to make that bring some kind of benefit back to the individual, it's one of these platform plays. It's probably likely going to be a winner-take-all type of market with an Apple or Google, one of those folks doing it. But now that's coming up against the techlash that people don't trust a lot of these big guys. Apple's trying to position itself as the champion of privacy. So I think there's just a lot of different. That's why I had a hard time wrapping my head around the question, because there are so many different entry points into it that are actually quite interesting.
Yeah.
But now Hannah, should we wrap it up?
Yes, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you everyone for your questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to any more. If you'd like to follow up with our presenters, feel free to leave a comment in the follow-up survey right after we end, or email Jody directly. His email is on your screen. And thank you, Michael, for sharing your insights on the data governance aspect of making precision medicine a reality.
Thanks.
For more information, you're welcome. For more information on precision medicine and a deeper analysis of the IT tools and services available, I encourage you to check out our new report, Precision Medicine and Health IT, New Data, New Challenges. I'll include the link along with the slide deck and a recording of this webinar in my follow-up email in a few days. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.